What generation am I in? A lot of us in this little age range are confused.
They've coined a micro generation called Zillennials.
Stuck between the definition of a millennial and a Gen Zer.
What is a Zillennial? Zillennial is a word meant to refer to those in the Millennial Generation Z cusp, so typically late millennials or early members of Generation Z. Perspectives on cusps and related terms like microgenerations vary though, so I do recommend checking out my video, What Are Cuspers?, to get a better understanding of the idea as a whole, so in this video we can focus on Zillennials. Zillennials experiences straddle generations, but one thing many of them have in common is the pop culture and media they consumed when they were younger. From observing Zillennials on the internet, this is a lot of what they like to talk about and share with one another. While some Zillennials, especially those outside of the US, may not relate to all of this, or even any of it in some cases, I'm going to run through some examples of what I've observed. In youth, they enjoyed Disney Channel sitcoms like Hannah Montana, Corey in the House, and The Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. Of course, there was some overlap with millennials slightly older than them and watching shows like Lizzie McGuire, The Proud Family, That's So Raven, Drake and Josh, and Phil of the Future. And members of Gen Z, who were slightly younger than them with shows like The Sweet Life on Deck and Wizards of Waverly Place. And yes, of course, people who fall outside of what I've mentioned could have watched these, or maybe they still do today. I'm just focusing on shows / media, etc. that were actively on the air or relevant for Zillennials when Zillennials were probably the target group. Those watching Nickelodeon may have watched All Grown Up, Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zoe 101, iCarly, and for some, maybe Kim Possible. There are also some long-running shows with maybe more generational overlap, like The Rugrats, which ran from 1991 till 2004, and SpongeBob, which started in 1999 and is still going today. By the end run of some of these shows, Zillennials may have transitioned onto other things like The Jersey Shore. Of course, many Zillennials watch reruns as well. Even Brady Bunch was on TV Land when some of them were young, so they could have gotten exposure to all kinds of things. Perhaps the biggest hit in terms of movies for school-age Zillennials was the High School Musical series. While the actors were a little older, those in the Zillennial range were the target audience, and it seems for me in this group, the show was a hit. The Avengers film were also popular though. Basically anything from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I think that is true to some extent in general these days. Other movies they might have liked include things like Shark Boy and Lava Girl and Spy Kids 3D. Many were in high school when Project X came out, so they may have also been part of the demographic for that film. While anime was already on the rise and Miyazaki films like Spirited Away had gained popularity with many millennials, I think this trend kind of continued with Zillennials and onward. And then other movies were popular are some of those that correspond with books. Popular books among self-identifying Zillennials include the Divergent series, the Percy Jackson series,
5-season live adaptation of Percy Jackson on Disney+.
the Twilight Saga, the Vampire Diaries, just about anything with vampires, the Hunger Games series, the Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and John Green books like The Fault in Our Stars. Music and fashion vary depending on year and personal preferences. I think these two topics can often be intertwined and connected to the overall culture. For example, while some may have been a little young for emo, some Zillennials may have been scene kids who shopped at Hot Topic and listened to bands like Asking Alexandria, Boys Like Girls, and Pierce Savell. They may have dressed colorfully or in darker clothes. Some Zillennials may have worn flower crowns, listened to Lana Del Rey, and reblogged quotes and pictures of sunsets on Tumblr. Some probably listened to Drake, wore shutter shades, snapbacks, and said things like swag and YOLO, perhaps the slang words most associated with the group.
To say my milk has been bad for like 2 weeks, but I gotta have my Lucky Charms. YOLO. I guess that.
And some people were all of these, or completely different. Other fashion choices in their slightly younger days could have included baggy jeans or skinny jeans, leggings with dresses, branded hoodies, etc. And on the screen, I'm just going to put some of the top hits on the charts in the US. The years 1996 borns turned 7, 13, 18, and 22 to show some of the music they might have heard during different periods of life. The earlier stuff seems a little bit age inappropriate, but they may have still heard it. As is generally the case, many also listened to music that was older than them and continued to listen to music as they got older. Now, while cultural topics may connect the group, it's not the only thing relevant to the Zillennial cusp. And FYI, just because someone is on the cusp doesn't mean they have to identify with being a Zillennial either. Part of what could make a person feel in between generations is their relationship to generational markers of their generation. For those in the middle, the markers of the generations on either side may not fit as well. There also may just be more variation in experiences of the people born at this time. On the millennial side, you could look to an event like 9/11 as an example. Of course, again, this is a more US-centric marker, but it is a popular one, and you can still take away the basic idea. Here are some different ways Zillennials might have experienced 9/11. They may have been aware of the event being significant, and so they remember it, maybe even well, but they didn't really understand what was going on at the time. 2, they may have been only vaguely aware of the event and remember it, but not very well. And they may not remember it at all, even if they were alive for it, because they were so young, or they weren't told about it, or something along those lines. Similarly, a Zillennial may have been alive for Y2K, but maybe they don't remember all the hype and worry surrounding it because they were young and shielded from it.
People were terrified the world was going to end.
In terms of 2008, Zillennials were still in school under 18 during peak recession years. They likely would have been more aware of it than Zoomers that were younger than them, but weren't impacted in the same way Millennials that were older than them were. Some of them actually started their careers when unemployment levels were lower than they had been for nearly all Millennials that came before them, at least in the US. Some caught the Great Recession recovery period though, and others tried to start careers in 2020. Of course, there's also regional variation and other factors play in. Plus, there have been changes to the job market and economy in general over the years, which have affected all of these people, but maybe we'll talk about that more in the future. On the Gen Z side, it seems like the biggest generational marker we're probably looking at right now is, let's just say, the events of 2020 plus. The metric of being school seems to be what might be used for Gen Z. In terms of Zillennials, they may be at different points of their life during this time. Some may be finishing up degrees, and others may be well into regular adult life. In general, Zillennials would be considered more in that young adult stage of life though. By most definitions, Zillennials would have been somewhere in the 18 to 24-ish range for the 2016 or the 2020 election, or both. Now, a lot of what I've been saying is based around Zillennials being born in approximately certain years. I'm mostly just going off current ideas around the term Zillennial. So let's look at some of those definitions and ideas. The term is still used mostly in a casual way and is relatively new, and so it is often Urban Dictionary that people look to in helping them understand the idea of a Zillennial. The website has a variety of definitions with varying degrees of popularity, and I will put some of those on screen. Depending on which one you look at, in this case, Zillennials seem to be defined by their relationship to the Millennial generation and Generation Z, certain experiences, and our birth years, of which the ranges seem to vary a fair bit. The metrics used to define Zillennials seem somewhat consistent with how self-identified Zillennials seem to define themselves. They may say they're a late Millennial, but they relate more to Gen Z, or an early Zoomer, but they feel they have more in common with Millennials, or they feel they don't relate to either, or that there's some kind of hybrid. They may use experiences related to pop culture, events, and technology to determine this. Of course, a lot of this is going off of their personal perceptions of each generation. Birth years are also frequently used, sometimes vague, sometimes specific. Here's a user-submitted definition on Collins Dictionary, which is similar. In a South African human resources magazine called HR Future, Dion Smit wrote an article where he mentioned microgenerations, of which Minion Z was one of them. He didn't seem to go into detail about the group, but he assigned years of 1993 to 1998. Partly because Zillennials have had so little presence outside of things I've mentioned, Smit is often cited in discussions around Zillennials. The subject of birth years can be slightly contentious though, and interpretations do vary, just as the cutoffs between generations do. For another perspective related to birth years, I wanted to share these graphics from Reddit. I did not make them, but I thought they're interesting. Now, people may have different opinions on where they would place the circles, what years they would place in the circles or at the point or whatever, but I think it gives more of that nuance. I actually do not think we need to be obsessing over birth years for cusps in general though. Sure, we can have opinions, but unless someone actually wants to study specifically the Zillennials or another cusp, it may not be necessary to set parameters. The reality is those in the middle are probably the ones that relate most to this idea, and as we go further on either side, some people relate and some don't. As we've discussed, it's more than the specific birth year that makes a person fit in the group. The age of your siblings, neighbors, cousins / people you hang out with in general, the age of your parents and guardians, and tons of demographic factors like the region you live in, your class, and more can all impact your experience and who you relate to. Another thing that factors in for some people is at one point they were told or saw somewhere that they were a part of one generation and later got conflicting information, and so that can be a confusing thing. Now let's talk about technology. I feel that to some degree we are constantly in a transitional phase with technology. I conducted a little survey and I want to talk about some things I found as they relate to the cusp. Even though this was limited overall, the general trends do seem to line up with other data I found on the web, at least to some extent. Of course, not all Gen Z years were represented, but anyway, the whole group of Millennials and Zoomers seem to have some things in common, at least to a certain point. Basically, everyone reported experiencing using a landline, and many still have one, / their parents do. If we look at CDC data, it says that 2014 was the year that over half of all children growing up in the US were in households without landlines / they had wireless phones only. Very few respondents of any age said they used a beeper or pager. There were a few across birth years that didn't seem to know what one was, but that seemed to be more associated with regional / country differences. Almost everyone across these ages reported they did have VHS tapes growing up, at least for a little bit. It was just the age at which they made the transition to DVDs that varied. For younger people, it was a lot younger. For older people, it was a lot older. The transition from VHS to DVDs is actually something commonly cited as a Zillennial experience. The reality is that it was a long, gradual process that started with millennials and went through Generation Z, at least part of it.
I just had the realization that Gen Z millennial cuspers are the physical embodiment of VHS DVD combo players.
Unfortunately, I forgot to differentiate smartphones, but in terms of cell phones overall, the age people said they got one just seemed to get younger over time. There was a similar trend with when people started using social media. With trends like these, if you wanted to use the transition as a generational marker, I think you would have to choose a certain age and say when over half or 75% of people or something like that did or used this, that's when the shift happened. But if you look at it overall, these so far, it's just kind of a gradual trend. I am curious what age people think would be the best place to put that though, or to put markers for these types of things. Feel free to comment below if you have any thoughts about that. One thing I will say is that nostalgically, Zillennials seem to be fond of those phones with the slide out keyboards, as well as flip phones. Now, it becomes easier to make more of a cutoff when asking, do you remember a time without this or before this? For example, the first person from my little survey to not remember a time before the internet was born in 1992. The answer gradually became more common, and among 95-borns, the majority reported they always had it, or at least they didn't remember a time of their life when they didn't have it. Most people born before 95 said they experienced dial-up, but for those born between 95 and 97, there was a mix. This tapered off, with 2000 being the last year, with people reporting both. And after that, the only answer was they didn't experience dial-up. A 2003 born was the first to say, "What is that?" And a 2006 born said, and I quote, "I'm not that old." Anyway, this is an area where we can see a real transition occurring. Now, if we step back, the data says it was in 2007 that over half of Americans had broadband. But there's likely regional variation. Whether or not a child used dial-up could also be dependent on when they started using the internet, at what age. The reality is some topics we're discussing, like social media, for example, were entirely new while millennials were growing up. Or even for some of them, they had basically reached adulthood as it was becoming a thing. And so the whole millennial generation had different experiences in this regard. And it's not simply Zillennials that experience changes. It just depends on what specific topic you're looking at. In terms of social media, Zillennials were some of the big users of platforms like Vine and Snapchat, but today some feel they are different from Gen Z because they don't use TikTok, while others do. The earliest of them may have used MySpace, but most of them started off on Facebook. If we look elsewhere in terms of apps, platforms, and services, Zillennials experienced some other shifts millennials as a whole experienced, like changes in the way we watch TV, listen to music, date, travel, communicate, etc. They were just a slightly younger age as these transitions were happening. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped you understand Zillennials a little better. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to see more content on the generations. And I will see you next time.